Welcome to Wake, a cold reading of James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, just to hear it out loud. Join Toby Malone and TJ Young, along with some special friends, as we puzzle our way through what we once thought was an unreadable book to produce a surprisingly listenable podcast. Welcome to a bonus episode of Wake, the podcast that uncovers the unusual, confronts the unconventional, and puzzles over the ponderous. All in the name of fulfilling a long-held bucket list item, reading James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake out loud just once. I am your host, Toby Malone, joined once more by the man who never shied away from a literary challenge in his life, TJ Young. Hi, TJ.
Hi, Toby. You're giving me way too much credit. I will tell you about the time I actively didn't want to read Frankenstein in 8th grade. I ended up doing it because I wrote a paper on it and she gave me a D. She was like, redo it. So I had to read the book anyway. But yeah, 8th grade.
But you came back.
I did.
That's
And I was like,
thing.
I love this book. So, here I am.
Isn't the importance and the thing that we've discovered about reading The Wake is that you just got to stick to it and forget about feeling like you have to know everything about it?
Oh, 100%. 100%.
Right, absolutely. So I have a question. What is the weirdest thing you've ever written?
There was that time that I was trying to write a play that was in part English, Yoruban, and Igbo at the same time.
Oh, absolutely. I helped you with that play.
while introducing some, I was like, I have no idea what I'm doing. That was the weirdest thing.
Writing about the underwater man, yeah.
An underwater man thrown off the boat in the Middle Passage. I was like, this is a lot.
I love that play. That play's got to be seen.
No one's ever going to do it. I'm gonna,
one day.
I'm going to make it a comic book, and then people will love it.
There you go. I think that feels thematically correct for today's conversation, because we do have a non-reading episode of Wake today. Once more, we're taking a well-earned diversion from the text to continue to fill out the world of the Wake. So I keep bringing up references to the weird today because today's guest is an artist, a visionary, and the gatekeeper to the Weirdoverse, including fascinating perspectives on Finnegan's Wake. Bobby Campbell, welcome to Wake.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I've been enjoying the show and everything that you guys have been building here, and yeah, very excited to dive in with you.
That means a lot to us, given that we're very much neophytes when it comes to Wake and Joyce, and we're just trying to stumble our way through, whereas you seem to have a very strong and robust network for this text.
What's fun though? I just saw that you followed me on Blue Sky, and then I followed you back, and I was going through your stream, and it's so neat, like seeing someone discovering all the weird little connections in Finnegan's Wake, all the weird things that you wouldn't think would connect, and all the little jewels that are out there. But what's great about it too is that the Wake is so inexhaustible that you can find new discoveries pretty easily. So even being new with it, there's stuff on there I was like, oh, I've never seen that. And so no matter how new you are to the text, I think that the Wake has a very leveling effect. And that, the newer explorers can still find things that people who have been doing it forever have yet to discover.
Yeah, absolutely. It feels very much like we have a right to be here to chip away at this as much as the people who've been reading it for 40 years. And it's great. I feel we are often worried that we're going to be called out for being for lacking knowledge on this text, but no one has yet. One day someone will.
Think that's not really the culture that surrounds it. It's not really a gotcha kind of book, I don't feel like. Whereas I feel like maybe Ulysses is. Ulysses maybe does have, because I feel like Ulysses is more encapsulated than the Wake is, and it's been more it's like a solved game at a certain point. It's I think it's as easy as it is to make new discoveries in Finnegan's Wake, is as hard as it is in Ulysses. Right. So I think in Ulysses it's easier to have things where people can express that they think you're wrong. In a way, with Finnegan's Wake, they're more going to say, oh, I don't see it that way, I see it this way. And I think that that's a very intentional thing in how it's constructed. I think it's meant to be that way.
I think that's the trap of novels in general, especially contemporary novels. It's like this novel is commentary on, a point towards, and an analysis of insert topic here, where the Finnegan's Wake seems to be like, hey, grab what you can
Right.
and leave the rest.
Yeah.
And I think
Absolutely.
with each person that we've spoken to through this process, it's like the power of literary illusions in general, about how they change based on your lived experience. And I feel like this book is actually morphing to the reader, as opposed to a lot of novels, which are like, and now here's my very narrow worldview. Not narrow is not the right word, but here's my very specific worldview that I'm trying to portray to you, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's
So-
also like, I think Finnegan's Wake also gets it. I think it's changed by way of its interpretation, maybe more than other books have, because it's so open to interpretation that that I think the reader has more of an impact on this book, than they can have on other books, because they can then create a construct or a lens through which other people then read it. And then when people read it through that lens, it reinforces those constructs. And so he even says it in the book, are my consumers not my producers? And I think again, I think he's thinking along those lines. I think he wanted people to kind of be a kind of co-creator through interpretation.
Yeah, I mean, as you listen to the show, as our listeners will know, Toby latches on to the very smart and analytical things, and I'm like, here's a poop joke, right? And like, that's my way in. And as a matter of fact, when I was talking to my partner, whenever he was like, what are you doing? And I came to him and I was like, this is a very naughty passage. Like, that was his way in too. And so, yeah, this just speaks to my level of humor and maturity, I guess. But yeah, it is very much, it's in there for you to find it any way that you need to.
Yeah, and I found that even when I was getting my kids to read on the podcast, they both did excerpts earlier on, and both of them latched onto different things than I would have thought. Certain words, the way that they sounded in their mouths, that really tickled them, that I would have maybe skipped over, but they were really stopped and laughed and then went back to, and just really interesting things like that. Whereas, and they're certainly not taking it from an intellectual perspective. They're 15 and 12, and so they're reading it just because I asked them to read it, and so they're just in that open-minded way that you can come at something without any preconceptions. Whereas I feel as though a lot of people will come at Joyce, particularly The Wake, and will immediately open it and go, okay, this is hard. I'm in for something hard. And so now it's going to be hard. And then they get 2 pages in and they say, I was correct, it was hard. And then they quit. And it's been really nice to forgive ourselves the idea that we are supposed to find it hard and go, yes, hard is a given. Let's push that aside. And now let's find out why this is still here, why people keep talking about it, why there are the communities around it, because it's not a global masochist society, the Joyce readership, no matter how much people may kind of assume it is. So in terms of the way that we met, speaking of groups of potential masochists, so we met when you invited us to participate in the second annual Maybe Night celebration, and I was so thrilled to get a chance to get there. It was one of those things where we started this podcast in May, and there's been a few, we were able to record on Bloomsday, and we were able to record on around the Maybe Night celebration, and we were able to observe certain things, and we're going to actually the final episode is going to come out on St. Patrick's Day. So we're feeling very, nice. Very much like we have a good handling of a lot of the events that happen. So based on your on your website, which we're going to promote in our show notes, you say the idea, in short, is to create the nocturnal equivalent of Bloomsday's celebration of James Joyce's day book Ulysses for his night book Finnegan's Wake. The tricky part is with Finnegan's Wake, quote, putting all spades in a nutshell. Can we reasonably pin down a date for such an occasion? Ulysses makes no bones about where it falls in the calendar, June 16, 1904, but the holistic chaosmus of Finnegan's Wake defies such specifics, except Joseph Campbell and Henry Morton Robinson, in their skeleton key for Finnegan's Wake, very casually and quite definitively give the date of the dream as the night of the winter solstice. So we all met on Zoom on the winter solstice, a hardy group of Finnegan's Wake scholars and enthusiasts. Can you tell us just a little bit about how you got this all together?
Yeah, so it was kind of something that accumulated over about 20 years, oddly enough. I was introduced to Finnegan's Wake by science fiction writer Robert Anton Wilson. So he was my favorite writer when I was in my 20s. I got to know him through these online workshops that he would put together. And it was just kind of Finnegan's Wake was assigned to me as a workshop assignment, and so that's where I first got introduced to the Wake, and so I kind of developed this working relationship with Mr. Wilson. After he passed, I went on to illustrate covers for his novels and interior art and all sorts of other associated projects. And one of the things was he had, when he was still alive, he lived in Santa Cruz, California, and they declared Robert Anton Wilson Day for July 23rd, based around his own personal mythology. So July 23rd is his Bloomsday, right? And he didn't like the idea of it being called Robert Anton Wilson Day, so he called it Maybe Day. And so and maybe logic was his bumper sticker encapsulation of his philosophy, which kind of works very well for James Joyce, where things are not true or false, they fall into this maybe state.
Right.
So I created a annual online art festival called Maybe Day, based around Robert Anton Wilson. And it was really fun, and it was going really well. And I kind of revisited this idea of Finnegan's Wake possibly taking place on the winter solstice, which I had encountered 2005 or something. And so it just kind of grew as an offshoot of Maybe Day. So you have Maybe Day, and then I was like, well, it would be fun to do this with another writer. And James Joyce has been someone that I've been working with their stuff for 20 years now. And it just kind of all came together as, this idea that it was fun to do Maybe Day. It makes sense if you have a Maybe Day to have a Maybe Night. And then there's this odd coincidence, and this is speaks a little bit towards what you were saying about how you feel like you're coming at Finnegan's Wake from this outsider perspective, and that there's these the more insiders that maybe are less welcoming of novice perspectives, and that's definitely where Robert Anton Wilson fit into things. He was a very successful writer who incorporated Joyce into everything he ever wrote, but was not welcomed into the Joyce community whatsoever. So it's that, and there is this whole other weird section of Joyce interpretation that it makes sense why it doesn't get welcomed into the more scholarly worlds, because it has to do with psychedelics. And so there is this whole wing of Joyce scholarship based on the observation that Finnegan's Wake bears a striking resemblance to the states of consciousness accessed through psychedelic substances. And so weirdly, there's all these 1960s philosophers who got super into Finnegan's Wake based off that connection. One of them obviously being Robert Anton Wilson, the other being Terence McKenna. Terence McKenna, very wild kind of raconteur, bard, philosopher guy, who he was basically the driving force behind what we saw as the 2012 meme. Remember when everyone thought that something weird was going to happen in 2012? That started with him, and oddly enough, where it started for him, the inspiration behind that was James Joyce and Finnegan's Wake.
Oh, amazing.
And so that whole 2012 thing, it was for most people, it was just an arbitrary art project. not really
Right.
something that you believed was going to happen, but it's like, what if you just chose a date 40 years in the future where you said something incredible was going to happen? Could you make something incredible happen? And it turns out no.
Right.
but so basically, he had a very interesting theory around time and memory and all these things that fit into Finnegan's Wake. And so that was all going to come to fruition on the winter solstice in 2012. And then right after I read that, I read the thing about Joseph Campbell saying that Finnegan's Wake takes place on the winter solstice. And so that just kind of, that coincidence just kind of put a pin in that date as related to Finnegan's Wake. And so I had maybe day, and then I was like, well, let's see if there's anything here. Let's see if this coincidence can create any sort of meaningful connection.
I mean, it makes so much sense when you stop to think about it that the dreaming is happening in the longest night of the
Right.
year.
Yeah, makes sense, right?
I find it super interesting, all this information about linking it to psychedelics and the manipulation of mind through psilocybins, things like that, right? Like, all of that is fascinating to me because we often talk about how long Joyce took to write this, right? And how he was losing his eyesight and how, like, his health was deteriorating. And we all know medicine back in the day was a little more potent than what it is now, right? In certain ways. And I'm interested in the fact that, like, those ideas were initially rejected, that they were initially put aside as if it doesn't show up in other forms of literature. I often talk to my students in particular about the poem Kubla Khan, right? And how absolutely on opioids, someone knocked on the door and he's like, oh crap, they broke my high and I can't finish this poem anymore. As if, like, those types of things haven't been a part of the creative endeavors of many writers for centuries.
Yeah, there was. So I think that is one of the like unsolvable mysteries, which is basically how did Joyce access this state of consciousness, right? Because was it just through scholarship and just like playing around with the etymology of words and how if you change the words you use, you change the state of consciousness? Was it a purely scholarly pursuit? I don't know that there's any evidence that he took any stronger substance than say absinthe. But there was so I had an interesting coincidence where one of the theories is that he had syphilis. That's one of the forbidden theories that would get you shouted down in more reputable circles because people don't like the idea to think that it came from either pathology or from mental deterioration based on a disease. Nobody wants to think that that's where this stuff came from. And I don't know that I necessarily believe it, but there's been research done that suggests at least Joyce suspected the possibility himself that he had contracted syphilis, and it makes sense with his eye problems and all that sort of stuff. So anyway, so I read that article that makes a pretty good case that you should at least consider the possibility that he had syphilis. Whether that was the key to his writing something so multidimensional, I don't know how believable that is. But anyway, so I read this article, and then I read this section of Finnegan's Wake to do a reading group with the Ukrainian Finnegan's Wake group, the Work in Progress, and it's all about syphilis. It's all about it's about his kind of conflict with Oscar Wilde, and it's all about Oscar Wilde, who famously was suspected of having syphilis. I think that's changed in recent years, and now they think he didn't, which is kind of an interesting reverse. If everyone thought Oscar Wilde had syphilis, now they don't. Previously, everyone thought James Joyce didn't. Now they think he does. It would be an interesting switch. But yeah, so it was literally like the day after I read this article about Joyce having syphilis that I read this section of Finnegan's Wake that's all about Oscar Wilde. And like I get to this point, and this a very fun thing about making unique discoveries in Finnegan's Wake. I come across this line that's Jess's Rosa Sharon. which is like a Rosh Hashanah reference. It's about Jesus and all this other stuff. But when you look into it, the person that Oscar Wilde supposedly contracted syphilis from was named Jess. Jess is Rosa Sharon. Rosa, the Rosha, like rash, rosy rash, Sharon. Jess shared her. You know what I mean? Like literally the day after I read this thing, I'm fully in Joyce talking about contracting syphilis. And so that's the weird thing about the wake is, one, it is kind of a Rorschach test in nature where I wouldn't have noticed that if I hadn't just read that. So clearly there was a part of me that was looking for those connections, probably because it was in my head. But also it was there. I mean, it's fully, like, if you look into the references, it's about Oscar Wilde. So the synchronicity aspect of Joyce is something that is a mystery. I mean, Carl Jung, who developed the theory of synchronicity, took most of that from Ulysses, even. Like, a lot of Jung's work derived from Joyce's, from critiquing Joyce's work. So there's kind of the weird aspect of Joyce is something that is not something that you can prove or believe, but it's also something that's hard to reject. And so that's the part of Joyce that interests me is the weirder corners. There's enough. I was just telling my kid about how, like, when you go to the University of Delaware library, there's 2 shelves of Joyce books, top to bottom, of scholarship based on it. They've got the literary aspect of this is well covered. Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of having fun in the margins, in the kind of the areas where there's still work to be done. So that's a little bit, it's a little bit about just, like, kind of finding, like, during our first Maybe Night discussion, a bunch of people there had found 9/11 in Finnegan's Wake. And I was like, come on, there's no way. But then when they read me the passages, I was like, that does sound like it. And so, again, is it because it is structured in a way that you can find anything? I don't think that Joyce was psychic. I don't think that's the answer. But you do. Robert Anton Wilson famously found the bombing of Nagasaki in Finnegan's Wake. There's a page that says Nogi Soki, and then, like, a couple sentences later, they're talking about geranium, and it's like, well, that's odd that Nagasaki is on the same page as uranium, but also, like, there's no, like, well, then how would that work? What, it doesn't. But it's still, it's this unexplored aspect of Finnegan's Wake that I would like to highlight and say that is out there, because once you say that, then other people can play around with it.
Well, yeah, and I think the idea of being able to come into the wake with the knowledge that there is this depth of meaning that is bottomless, that everything means something and everything means something else, means that you're encouraged to be continually looking for the further meaning. It's not like a story that is, it is what it is. It says is what it says in the end. There's so much more depth of possibility, and so then it's sort of like searching for words in a word scramble, where you've got all these letters that don't mean anything, but you've got words hidden within it, and so your eye is drawn to the word that you are drawn to, and there are certain kinds of so you'll find a reference to 9/11. If you're looking for references to 9/11, you could make that connection. And obviously, like you say, he's not Nostradamus, and no one's claiming he is, but the fact that he has that sort of totality of the human experience covered in some way means that you can get something or other. TJ and I were quite pleased early on to find that both of our names are in the wake. We're able to.
My first name that I never see anywhere.
Right.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah.
And then that led us to a conversation, because TJ's first name is Thornton, and so then that led us to a whole conversation about Thornton Wilder, which led us to a whole revelation that Thornton Wilder was a great Wake scholar, and sort of.
That is, the network of people that are connected to it, and the people that you will discover that you already like that are a part of this is incredible. Like, I couldn't believe Marshall McLuhan is a huge Wake scholar,
Massive Wake
and I
scholar,
had no idea. Like, it was, the network of people connected is half the fun.
I
Yes.
low-key want to read this again now and just look for all the times that James Joyce made a passage basically a diss take. You know, like talking about Oscar Wilde in that way is I'm just like, who else is he dishing on?
Where it's all his
I just discovered that he really had a problem with Oscar Wilde, apparently. and it makes sense. Apparently it was because he was an Irishman who then wanted to go become a celebrity in England and converted to Catholicism, with Joyce's two biggest enemies. Like if anything, Finnegan's Wake is meant to take down England's domination of Ireland and the Pope.
Right.
And so, which is why that's one of HCE's crimes that he's accused of in the park is killing the king and the Pope.
Right.
So that is what he's trying to. That is what Joyce is trying to do. Or you could look at it that way. I shouldn't say is.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, it's in terms of looking at it that way. You mentioned that network. You managed to collect together a really eclectic and impressive network of scholars to the Maybe Night event. Can you speak a little bit about how you got hold of them and what kinds of people were involved over those two previous conversations?
Sure. So the original Maybe Night is mostly people who also studied with Robert Anton Wilson at the Maybe Logic Academy. That's my core group of people that I've been reading Finnegan's Wake with for since 2004. So that was the initial group, and amongst that group are people who have gone on to write books, like Eric Wagner's writing his Joyce and Robert Anton Wilson book. Oz Fritz has been he's mainly an audio engineer, but has become like a pretty prominent scholar in esoteric studies. So after the first Maybe Night, it turned out coincidentally that the day after the winter solstice, that the Ukrainian Finnegan's Wake group coalesced, and they decided to start reading Finnegan's Wake, and reached out to me because I don't even know where they initially saw the Maybe Night thing, but it was a coincidence of them having decided to read Finnegan's Wake right after we had held our event. And it was really Alexander from the Wake in Progress group who reached out to everyone. That's how you get Raphael from Fleet, and I would imagine he probably reached out to you, if I'm not mistaken. And so it was really his vision of connecting people together, and it was amazing, the amount of people that he was able to pull in, and it also introduced me to all these in progress Finnegan's Wake projects, because I've been doing this for so long that most of the Wake projects that I started with are no longer around. It's because this stuff comes and goes. There's a lot of dead links in Finnegan's Wake study. So it was great to see things that are in progress and also so much better developed than they used to be.
Right.
So I got to give credit to Alexander from the Wake in Progress group. It was really his. He did all the reaching out and brought everybody together. It was so I just had my core group from the old days, and then we added to that a lot of incredible people that I hadn't really been aware of before he found them.
Yeah, it was really an interesting conversation. I think we were connected from our friend Richard Hart, who has the other Finnegan's Wake podcast that's out there. And so he's doing a much more in-depth performance of the text, and that's going to take him something like 6 years or something to finish. We're going to finish ours in 10 months. But
I couldn't believe how far along you guys were. When I was going through, I was like, Page 300. That's amazing.
We keep it pushing.
Yeah, we've only got like 50 pages left now as of time of recording, so we should be fully done soon. And so Richard's doing his version, and so Richard and I go way back into the Toronto theatre scene. And so I think Alexander had reached out to Richard to ask if he would be interested in participating, and then Richard very kindly invited us to
great,
connect with you. And so it's interesting because when we first proposed the podcast, to TJ, my first thing I did was look to see what other options were out there, and there were very few. There were a couple of podcasts. There was one podcast that said, I'm going to do a deep reading line by line of Finnegan's Wake, and I'm going to really take my time with it. And I think that's a really interesting idea. The podcast was 45 minutes long. He managed to get one paragraph in and gave some analysis of what he read, and it was very thoughtful and interesting. And then that was the last episode.
Right.
Because it becomes kind of daunting. And so the idea of doing that for 628 pages is just about impossible. And then I think there have been others, but I may be wrong, and I'm happy to be corrected by anyone out there, but I believe we are about to be the first podcast to ever fully read The Wake.
That's awesome.
Because I don't think anyone's recorded it in podcast form, or at least not that we find openly available. Obviously, there are audiobooks, and people have read it through, so we're certainly not saying that we're pioneers in that sense.
But call Guinness right now.
Yeah.
Want that record. And
Have you listened to the Waywords and Mean Signs project? Because I don't think they did the whole book. That's
right.
And they were more focused on the musical adaptation part of it, I think.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was one of the resources we name checked in our context episode right off the top. And so there's been lots of really good ways in, and lots of audio books that have taken 28 hours to read through and things like that. And so what we're trying to do is come at it from a different angle, and it's not always pretty and it's not always accurate, but we're having fun doing it, and that really is the main thing. And so when I came to that group and met all these other Joyceans, all these other Wakians, it was really fascinating to see that other people have similar kind of ideas. Like I found it very interesting that Richard's podcast essentially started, right around the time that ours started, and for no apparent reason. Obviously, they predated us a little bit. But when I first saw his, I thought, oh, he's going to think I stole his idea. But it's not really the same thing. So we can all coexist, and we can coexist in different ways. And so the Ukrainian Finnegan's Wake journey mind maps was sort of fascinating. Where
isn't it the best?
Where they'll meet.
Like, what a perfect way to represent the experience of reading The Wake is to have it in those word cloud and sketches and the visual representation. That is what it's like to read a passage of Finnegan's Wake, find a hook, and then dig your way in, and it just kind of spreads out into this kaleidoscope. And
right.
Yeah. It's outstanding.
Yeah, there's a real sense of unpeeling the onion, and so you start going down those rabbit holes, and then you pull and pull and pull. And I really admire that methodical way of reading through. And obviously, we're not doing that here. We're much faster, but at the same time, we I think we all work in the same kind of stratosphere where we're trying different things, and we're all bringing different perspectives. And I think there is a place for a fast reading of Wake, is in the same way that there is a slow reading.
That's the beauty of the Wake, is that it welcomes multiple approaches more than anything. I think that you could probably have 12 Finnegan's Wake podcasts, and there would be surprisingly little overlap in how they approached it, what they found in it. And I don't think that you would get the same thing out of a dozen different interpretations, because there's so many different through lines that, I think that you would get completely different viewpoints. And what's great about the fast read through is that you're at the end of it, you're going to have a very listenable version of Finnegan's Wake that also has these little pockets of interpretation. So it's a little bit best of both worlds situation, because Finnegan's Wake is a little bit like it's a little bit of a lonely journey if you
Mm.
only do the text. If it's just the text only, I think it's a little bit like just you're off in your own world. But also, you don't also just want to have someone else's interpretation of it, because then it's like having someone else eat your food for you.
Right. Yeah.
But so I think the happy medium is a really good approach, where it's like, here's a long stretch of the source material, and now here's our relationship with that source material.
Right.
And then you get the little tendrils that shoot out, and it's like, oh, this person is also into this person is also into this, and you create this whole network of meanings and associations and collaborators. And I think that's how this thing has kept going for, almost 100 years.
Yeah, and I think that us pushing through and finishing the book does something, at least for me and my psyche, to be like, I have done it. So now if I go back through, I know that it is doable, right?
Yes.
It's kind of like when you sit down to watch a 3.5 hour movie. The first time you watch that movie, you're like, I'm going to be here forever. But there's something about the second or third time you watch it, you're like, oh, this isn't so bad. I now know what to expect. I know the pacing, and things like that. I think that just allow. Because a couple months ago when Toby was like, when are you going to reread this? I was like, never. And now I'm all like, give me a couple years and I'll come back to it. And I'll be like, okay, I've done it. So now I can actually go through and pour over it in a more meticulous way.
And we like to say to our listeners that if they've listened to us through, it's only 40 episodes or so, if they listen to the podcast all the way through, then they've read Finnegan's Wake.
Sure.
You don't have to have cast your eye over every word and pondered over every meaning. You can have experienced this book and be able to say, okay, the journey is sort of almost more important than the destination. And while a lot of people rave about the beauty of the last 20 or 30 pages and it being the culmination of everything we've read, we're hoping that that's the case. But at the same time, that's not really the point. We're not really trying to find meaning in it. We're trying to have completed it in the most respectful possible way. As opposed to, we're not like those, the people you see on social media who are jacking up their totals of how many books they've read this year just for clout to say, and so it's not really about that, but it is about saying there's lots of room in the Finnegan's Wake tent, and we're taking up a little corner of it, and we're hopefully stimulating a conversation, because we've had some readers who've come in and read with us who have gone away and said, now I want to approach the book again because I thought it was going to be too hard for me or too scary. And in fact, it's really fun. And I'm actually now going to take it up and look at it again, which, what more can we ask?
That's amazing. Yeah,
that's right.
And also I would, we talked about a little bit about this on Maybe Night, but I would make the case that it's probably a necessary thing to also experience the book in audio form, because so much of it was designed to be liturgical. So much of it was meant to be heard as opposed to read. And I think that, I think that it being read out loud, sort of like the Upanishads in Hinduism, it is only to be read out loud. The text itself is, at least according to what I learned in college, I'm sure people could disagree, but it's meant to be heard, not read. And so you don't even get credit for having read the sacred text, because you have to hear the sacred text. And so I think with Finnegan's Wake, it's probably meant to be both. And so I think you should probably do a time through both reading it and hearing it. And I think that'll give you an even more multi-dimensional viewpoint on it.
Yeah, we had really multi-dimensional views on the text from that Maybe Not conversation. We had a panel with people from all sorts of walks of life doing all sorts of different things. We had people doing podcasts like ours, or people who were in reading groups, or full-on scholars, people who were hardcore Joyceans. And it was a really interesting thing. I remember halfway through the event, I texted TJ and said, I found the purists.
yeah, for sure.
Because we spend so much time fearing the purists. What will the purists say?
I didn't tell you what happened when you sent me that text, Toby. I was walking down an icy hill. I saw that, and I I chuckled so hard that I slipped and fell.
As the purists intended. So it was interesting. I think I sent that when there was a lively debate sparked when someone asked the innocuous question, is Finnegan's Wake written in English? And
yeah, I did not expect that to be contentious. I meant it as a silly question.
it was an interesting question too, because I think at least half the room that were there are non-English speakers. And so
Right, yeah.
when you're a non-English speaker coming at a text that is written in English, but not in English that you would recognize from Duolingo, what does that look like? And can you then say, okay, this is in a made-up language, but then you go, well, this is in English, but in corrupted English, but then it's also in 40 different other languages. And so people were quite heated in their responses to that, which I thought was great.
Yeah, Toby sent me that. He told me that they asked that question, and I was like, I could answer that right now, like in that moment. But even just thinking about, follow my tangent, a friend of mine is in speech therapy, and she often talks about whenever she's teaching children how to say words properly in English, the thing that she is not allowed to remove by her Hippocratic oath is like their dialects, their specific syntax that's related to their culture, their community, and things like that,
right.
And how a lot of times those things aren't considered quote unquote proper English, but they are, inherent to the culture, the specificity, the time, the place, and all those other things. And I was like, so much of this book, Toby and I talked about very early on about how it almost forces an accent in your mouth if you say it out loud. How it's phonetic in that way. And exploring English, especially since so many English words are actually derivative of words from other languages. It feels like, it does feel like an antiquated question, but at the same time, I think it's at the root of why it is infinitely explorable, because it is the only book that I've ever read that made me remember what it's like to learn how to read for the first time.
Oh, yeah.
And so you are recapturing language and reclaiming language in a completely different way.
So there's an interesting component of this, I think, that is intentional, because one of Joyce's big influences is Giambattista Vico.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the big things that one of his like guiding philosophies was language as class warfare. And especially because Vico was working under the eye of the Inquisition. And so he had to be very clever in the way he spoke so he could speak about the things he wanted to speak about without ending up in trouble. And Joyce, too, and so when Ulysses gets published, there's a whole big a long protracted legal battle about Ulysses being obscene. And like a whole edition of it gets burned. And like it's something that was probably definitely on Joyce's mind, this idea of like being able to use language to change class structure, because if you can use language in a clever enough way, you can evade the censors. You can also create new realities by creating new languages. And so I'm a high school teacher, and one of the things that you see if you do it long enough is the slang from 10 years ago is the everyday dialect of today.
100%.
Language grows from the ground up, and it changes the world from the ground up. And no matter how much you want to stop it, it's unstoppable. Slang is unstoppable, and it filters up through the world and change. Like one of the big like other philosophical components in my kind of Robert Anton Wilson influenced interpretation of the wake is what's called the Worf-Sapir hypothesis. It's got a lot of different names now, which is basically the words that we use and the language that we use influences how we view reality. And so it's the antiquated way to talk about it would be like Inuits have 100 words for snow. I think that turned out not to be true, but it's the idea that the more the language you have, it influences how you view the world. And if you introduce new language, you see the world in different ways.
Yeah.
And I see Finnegan's Wake as like a explosion of novelty in viewing the world in new ways. And I think that it is very much structured similarly to how slang grows organically and then infiltrates into the society that tries to repress it. Because so much of slang is just like Joyce language. When you interpret slang and you chase it back to where it came from, it's so clever. It's beautiful. It's like it's never it's treated like it's this like perversion of language, but it's actually like a very complex, beautiful expression of language. And I think Finnegan's Wake is very much in that world, and intentionally so. I think it was designed to be that.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's such an eloquent way of putting it. And we often forget that English is such a young language. It's among the youngest of languages, really, when we talk about all the other tongues that are spoken out there. And
sometimes it's lazy. Like we'll just lift the whole Schadenfreude. We're just not even going to try. We're just going to thank you so aperitif. Thank you so much. This is now over here. I think about that often. How we're just like, no, thank you. We're just going to use this and act like, you know.
And then, of course, people will often point out the 40 languages that are in. But then, of course, the English language is peppered with words like that, like you say, from German or French or
it's almost
Italian.
kind of like becoming a meta language in a way, like a language that is comprised of other languages, which it already was to begin with. But I think it being the default, like common ground language, at least currently, like a lot of times, like when people in European countries speak Italian and Spanish, they're probably going to speak to each other in English because that's the language that they both know.
Right.
And I think English is kind of this interesting thing because it's only when it is allowed to change. I think the more English is like you try to keep it in one place, I think that's a negative aspect of English where it's trying to keep things out. But the more English is welcoming of other languages and incorporates other languages into it, I think it's kind of a beautiful thing.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting that in Book 3, Chapter 4, when the dreamer finally starts stirring, and when it wakes up at that point, ALP soothes him back to sleep. She speaks in Esperanto.
Isn't that so good?
Yeah, which is an invented language.
Yeah.
That is a collaboration of a bunch of different other Romance languages that was created. Joyce must have just loved the existence of Esperanto.
For sure. For someone like him, that must have been like a dream. The idea that you could construct a language from scratch that would be learnable by everyone.
Oh, yeah, and I wonder what he'd think of the university degrees you can take in Klingon or Elvish now.
And I love how, Toby, I love that you just point out, it's like in juxtaposition to what I would say is probably the cleanest, most simplest use of English when he does stir. It's very forward. The sentences are very short. It's very clearly descriptive. It is, and then to butt it up against this completely fictional language is like complete knowledge of like it's like that thing. He's like, yes, I could write this way, but I'm actively choosing not to, so deal with it.
Yeah, and reminding us that all language is fictional. If you go back far enough, everything has just been invented at some point by someone, and we've just learned it and accepted it.
One of the things that I find interesting is I read most of his letters, his personal letters, especially from later in his life. And I'm always fascinated by how careful he was to write very, very straightforwardly in his correspondence to prove that he wasn't just crazy.
Right.
Like I'm writing like this as a choice. I'm not just over the barrel and in Wonderland. I can still communicate normally, which I find that kind of a fun thing that he's making the distinction. Like he didn't. whatever he wanted this language to be, I don't think it was meant for ordinary conversation, maybe, because he did not use it that way. The only people I ever saw him communicate to that way was his brother and Sylvia Beach. They were the only two people that he would show that side of himself to outside of the work. So I find that interesting, like that it was, it was just like too personal to share with random people, or I don't know. So it kind of begs the question: what are these kind of words for? Are they meant for personal expression, or are they just meant for art? Or it's kind of a fun little thing, because he invented a whole language but constrained his usage of it.
Yeah, it's like the thing that separates the poet from the lecturer, right? We expect poets to use flowery language in one medium, but if they talk to you in rhyming couplets, you're like, if you don't get out my face right
now. For sure.
Yeah, but then it's also kind of very poignant that Joyce's last words reportedly were, "Does nobody understand?"
Oh, yeah.
And so that tragedy that he's got this music that he's putting down, and nobody, and everyone just goes, well, he's mad. He's mad. It's nonsense.
Yeah, I get the impression that Finnegan's Wake was like, he I don't think he enjoyed any particular success from Finnegan's Wake.
No, I think the opposite.
I think it was all that, and even I have a little bit of a conspiracy theory. Can I share my conspiracy theory?
Love it.
So you know that book, our examination around his factification for incamination of work in progress, where so basically he gets a bunch of his like highfalutin literary friends to write positive reviews of Finnegan's Wake, to be like, no, look, Beckett says it's good.
Yeah.
So he organized that partially as a defense. He did allow for criticism of the Wake in there as well, for balance. But I think he was trying to, one, kind of defend it and kickstart the exegesis, because Finnegan's Wake only works with an exegetical construct running parallel with it, I think.
Right.
So he's trying to kickstart that exegesis, right? Skeleton Key to Finnegan's Wake comes out like 4 years after Finnegan's Wake is published, and is a complete remains the most complete breakdown of Finnegan's Wake that exists. 4 years after it was published.
Crazy.
A little bit quick. I know it's
so fast.
I know it's Joseph Campbell. He's a very smart guy. Henry Morton Robinson doesn't appear to have done. It's his most famous work. It's not like he's some heavy hitter, it seems like, historically speaking. Joseph Campbell famously went to Shakespeare and Company to get a copy of Ulysses that he saw around Paris, met Sylvia Beach, was enraged that Ulysses was written so oddly, went back, and Sylvia Beach gave him a bunch of resources to help him understand Ulysses. I think the Skeleton Key to Finnegan's Wake might have been an inside job. I think he might have gotten guidance from either Sylvia Beach or Joyce through Sylvia Beach. Because how else why is it that the most complete understanding of Finnegan's Wake was written in 1942? Or 44? That seems, that seems a little bit odd. I don't know that that's necessarily true, but it's something that I think about a lot in terms of how serious, because basically Joseph Campbell sometimes goes off of the map in terms of his Joyce interpretation, and it's like, well, is he working with inside information, or is he just making stuff up? And so it's something to think about. Like Joseph Campbell has like this whole bit about what Joyce was going to write after Finnegan's Wake, and he presents it as fact. No one else has a reference for this. Where did he get that Joyce was going to work on something simple about the sea?
Right.
As far as I can tell, no one found that source. So did he get it from him directly? And then that leads into my question about the winter solstice. I don't see that on those pages at all. Like and it's in the section that you were just talking about, where he wakes up and gets eased back to sleep by
That's right.
ALP using Esperanto. I don't see where it says that it's the winter solstice at all, but Joseph Campbell states it plainly that this is what's happening. So it's I always wonder if there was a direct link there.
If that's the theory that you're selling, I'm buying it. I mean, I think that we can't take for granted for the fact that like so many people were running in the same circles and having an open dialogue about this, right? If I wrote a play today, I would fully expect for Toby to be able to publish something in 2 years to be like, and this is what TJ meant, because we
Right.
talk, we have conversations. Like
Right.
there's. And he wouldn't have to go to any other sources. He wouldn't have to. It wouldn't be a huge leap, right, for him to do that. I just think that Finnegan's Wake is so thick that he's probably like, it's just going to take me a little bit to get it all together, but like I got it. And you know, it is. I think it's also foolish to think that James Joyce was operating without answering questions ever. You know, that people weren't like, okay, I hear you, but what? What is it? And as stubborn as he might seem in the literary form, obviously he had people who were willing to back him up because he had conversations.
Yeah, and Nora Barnacle was quoted on multiple occasions as saying, "Why is everyone focusing on Ulysses? Finnegan's Wake is the one. Finnegan's Wake is the book." And so obviously he's talking to his friends, his family, his disciples about what he's writing. Not everyone is dismissing him, and so yeah, it's a convenient kind of argument to say, oh well, Joyce was completely isolated and abandoned because Finnegan's Wake was a failure. But I don't. Yeah, like you say, the reality. I mean, it's like to extend your metaphor there, TJ. Is there's a reason why the Gospels are the Gospels in the Bible
because they all talk.
The reason why there's so much credence put in the Gospels is because they're all Jesus' buddies. There was things written by guys who were there. That's why we like them. Whereas if they were written 200 years later by someone who,
like, who are you?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I love that. I love that theory of Campbell being an inside man, or at least having access to documents, or having chatted to Joyce.
Something. Yeah. Clearly, so there was a time when Joyce thought that he might not survive to finish Finnegan's Wake, and he queued up his friend Stephen James to be the guy to finish it if he died before he finished it. So he must have explained at least a roadmap to Stephen James so he would know how to finish it.
And then of course the cynical response to whether or not Campbell was had this inside information is that once Joyce is dead and gone, there's no need to reveal your sources. You can take all the credit for being this brilliantly insightful. It's not as though Joyce is sitting on the sidelines saying, "Hey, I told you all that stuff, and now you haven't given me credit." So, why would Campbell say, "I'm just transcribing what Joyce told me"?
Well, I also think about the potential to seem like self-masturbatory if Joyce had been like, "And here you go." A, I feel like that completely undercuts his whole entire goal. And B, there's something about like, I take information more seriously if it's coming through like a journalistic source that I knew ran that interview in a way that I respect, as opposed to, you're just saying the thing because you can say it and there's no one to check you, right? I think that there is that that one degree of separation, but still that academic filter that helps give it credence. And yes, Joyce could have been like, and here's a compendium that I released you, but it also feels like it's creating an easy way out that he doesn't want you to take. He doesn't create a glossary. I'm reading this book right now that's like a fantasy book that's based in indigenous culture, and there are words in there I was like, I've never seen that before. And there's a glossary in the back, but I'm like, I'm challenging myself to pick up context clues. Be like, I think this is what this means, right? I'll check myself later. But there is that he doesn't want us to have an easy way out. And if he supplied us with the answers, he's supplying us the easy way out. Because who's to say I couldn't just be like, oh, Well, he wrote the answer to the equation, so I'm just going to read the answer.
Yeah. And I think, like, when I read online, when people are saying, "How do I start reading Joyce? How do I read Ulysses? How do I read Finnegan's Wake?" A lot of the responses say, "Make sure you get a good annotated edition." And I think, no, that's cheating. That's you can get the edition of Ulysses, which is another 200 pages longer because it has marginalia and footnotes, and it gives you context. So this is what this reference is to this in the Odyssey, and this is now we can, here's a reference, which is fine. I think that's fine for. I mean, I think that's a good way in if you need a crutch, but I think that's also not trusting the author. That's saying I need an editor to help me with the text, and it's. I think it's. I mean, maybe like I think we said a few episodes ago, we're sort of turning into purists of a certain kind of ourselves because I read that and go, no, we're not. I wouldn't recommend anyone read an annotated Finnegan's Wake because it would be very distracting, and it would also. I mean, it's like sometimes the annotations send you off in the wrong directions, like in the Night Lessons episode where you go, "Oh, we're going to get all these footnotes. They're going to help us," and they do no such thing.
Is that the one where he's got the annotations all over the page?
That's it. Yes.
Yeah. My favorite experience with that was I'm reading that, and every time when I go to the annotation to read it, I have trouble finding where I was,
right?
Because it all looks the same. So I would end up reading the same paragraph over and over again because I would jump back to the wrong spot. And then in the text, he goes, "Wait, where's the spot? I lost it."
Yes.
It was intentional. He meant for you to get lost. And I was fell into his trap that he specifically put there. And then he has a spot where he's laughing at me for it. It was
amazing. It's so good. Yeah.
Do you know about his grandson, Stephen Joyce? So he was the executor of his estate,
right.
and was a huge pain in the ass to anyone that wanted to do anything like what we've been doing.
Yes,
would not have allowed it. Would have, we both probably would have gotten cease and desist letters if he was still around.
Right.
But he does. And everybody hates him for it because he shut down. Probably would have been a lot of cool stuff.
Right.
But he does have one interesting point that speaks to what you're saying, which is he was really against all the guidebooks and all the scholarly stuff because he thought that it scared away the regular reader.
Right.
Because the regular reader looks at this thing and it's like, well, you got to read 3 books before you read Ulysses. I'm just not going to read Ulysses.
Yeah.
And you can just read Ulysses. You can just read Finnegan's Wake. And I do think that while half the fun of it is the exegesis, it is also a giant gate that probably does keep people out in a way that is self-sabotaging. And that really the key to reading Joyce, I think, is you read it for what it means to you, not for what it means overall. And I think that you can get really far just reading it with that attitude. I absolutely loved Ulysses and did no prep work. Just went right in, read it for what it meant to me. And I think something that's interesting about Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, because they have a reputation as being difficult books, I don't even think that they're difficult intellectually. I think they're difficult emotionally. I think what it's saying is kind of hard to deal with emotionally more than intellectually. It's hard to deal with something that is talking about this, the extension of self into eternity is a lot to take on. and it's not because the words are hard. It's because the subject matter is difficult. And I think that's an underrated aspect of Joyce, is where the difficulty is actually coming from.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's modernist literature in general. People forget the fact that they're trying to wrestle with very heady topics in a way that they're like, the world is, I'm struggling to make sense of the world and my place in it. So why should our literature and our art line up with anything that makes that level of sense, right?
Yeah. I also, so something else, and you guys might be particularly well suited for this. See what you think about this. So you know how we have postmodernism, which no one really, weird for the sake of weird, no one really was able to pin it down in any meaningful way. And then now we're in what a lot of people call metamodernism, which just seems to be a circle back to we haven't solved modernism yet. We haven't integrated it into our culture. Like, if you look at what came before, fully solved games that anyone can understand. Realism, romanticism, all fully integrated into our culture that anyone can understand and is fully present in any TV show that you turn on or any piece of pop culture. I don't think that we've successfully solved modernism yet. And I think we're going to be stuck in this loop until we do. And I think that Joyce is probably and Finnegan's Wake especially, is probably the capstone of modernism. And the interesting thing is, how do you integrate Finnegan's Wake into a culture? It's inexhaustible. It's like an Alka-Seltzer that is a mile brick, and it just is dissolving into the ocean over centuries. It's this interesting quandary of, we can't move on until we digest it, but it's undigestible.
I also think that we will never be able to move on thanks to technology. I asked my theater students to define what, if they could name a theatrical movement that we are in, if they could name it, what would it be?
Yeah.
And one student came up with the best thing. And I'm like, yeah, he's like, theater of the buffet. He's like, you just take what you want and you can leave the rest, because we have so many influences coming from so many directions that at any given time we can shut one thing off. We don't have to sit with it. We don't have to sit in it. We don't have to be completely bombarded by a whole group of people who are like, and this is the movement now. We can say, that's cool. You do that over there. Let me touch some of this. And then I might come back to that. And I was like, you're right. I think that, when we get to things like the futurists or Dadaism or any of those other movements, it's because that's all that was happening. You had to process it. And now we're all like, cool, you can be a modernist, you can be a postmodernist, you can even be a metamodernist, but I can go back to the Romantic period if I want to and just lose myself over there, and then still touch into naturalism, and then still do like the well-made thing over here. It's like, there's never a need to sit and actually process through a movement.
Right. No, that's beautiful. That makes perfect sense. In terms of the technology thing too, Marshall McLuhan being a huge Joyce scholar, and if you read Understanding Media from the 1960s, he basically thought, because of television, that our nervous systems were extended into a giant super organism. And that was just based off the TV. Can you imagine what the world would look like to him right now? Like, how integrated the individual is, integrated but also fractured, and it's I think you're right that it might be that we've headed into a kaleidoscopic reality that is unable to be encapsulated. It's just bigger than we can understand.
But then one thing that he might have appreciated is that at least the technology means that we have the opportunity to connect with other people globally who are interested in similar things to what we're interested in, and have these discussions and pull this text apart, because he was always interested in people analysing Finnegan's Wake, or reading it in depth, or taking their time with it, and being able to connect people so they're not feeling isolated and giving up in disgust. But you have people who are able to have these reading groups online. People are able to have the events like Maybe Night, and then also have resources like the Reddit community that we have, r/James Joyce, which you're a moderator on. So, I mean, can you tell us a little bit about that community?
Sure. It's grown in size recently. It's been getting bigger. We hit 7,000 users recently, and I must have took over as one of the moderators like over 10 years ago. It's been a while. It's kind of a quiet community, but it's there's always a couple of posts a day. It doesn't require much moderation.
Right.
There was a brief period where we would get print on demand Joyce t-shirt spam bots, which I thought was kind of a funny thing. Just like maybe 5 times a week, a new version of the bot would post a link to the same James Joyce T-shirt sold through a different print-on-demand place. So that was the only like real thing that required moderation. Recently there was a guy. So what it looked like what he was doing was he was finding old pictures, just any old picture, and then claiming that they were James Joyce and his family, despite them looking nothing like James Joyce and his family, and selling them on eBay. And I was like, come on, that's not James Joyce. Stop posting this stuff. And he just kept doing it. And I banned him for a day. I banned him for a week, and he kept doing it. So I just banned him. And I assumed it was a bot, but it was a person. And every couple of weeks, he sends me an increasingly lengthy denunciation, and it's like delved into like CIA remote viewing, like pure insanity. And that's the only two like real like moderation things I've ever had to deal with, because it's just a quiet literary community, and somebody posts something and then people kind of pick it apart. It's really what I love about it though is the average like competency of each poster is incredibly high. You really do, you get a really good reading resource from, like, if you want an answer to a question and you pose that question to that group, you're going to get a lot of especially well-informed responses.
Right.
It's really what you were saying about like kind of being hesitant to go there because of the purists. They do not really seem to take that attitude. There's not really that aspect of it. They're just happy to have more people to talk about Joyce with. And there's not I almost never see arguments, and I almost never see like denunciations or anything like that.
I use that subreddit quite often when we're doing the tiny bit of research that we do for each episode. So we're just pulling content, and as I said, every now and then someone will say, I'm reading Finnegan's Wake. Has anything helped you read it? And I go into the comments to say, I wonder if anyone's listened to this podcast, and no one has mentioned the podcast yet, which, fine, we're a niche thing. And then I'm sort of tempted to post and say, hey, we have this podcast. But then I'm also terrified that someone's going to say, this is awful. This, and what are you doing? You've destroyed Joyce. So I'm a little. So maybe I'll take this as with a little bit of courage and advertise the podcast.
Yeah, I think you should. It would probably be good to post it regularly, like just because you would probably get a running commentary. Because if someone was just talking about how they wanted to join a Finnegan's Wake reading group, and like so you get people who are brand new, and you get a good mixture of people who are already well into it. I think that people would respond well to it. I don't think that anyone would be against there being a James Joyce or
I'll know I'll have a moderator in my corner. So
for sure. Yeah. If everybody starts talking trash, we'll just get them out of there.
Perfect. Excellent. So we've taken up a lot of your day, so I don't want to keep you too much longer, but I do have one last question for you. I read in an interview that you gave, you were talking to someone about how in the United States, Finnegan's Wake is still under copyright until 2035. And so that's the public domain date is coming. Obviously, we can do what we're doing here because we're recording in Canada. But so you mentioned that you have some plans for what happens when Finnegan's Wake comes into the public domain. Do you have any clues as to what kinds of plans you might have?
Sure. So this came about as part of the discussion I was having with the Ukrainian Finnegan's Wake group, where it was, we were puzzling over the age-old question, like, what was Joyce trying to do with this book? And it had clicked together that I thought that he was probably trying to create some kind of sacred text, that it was meant to be. It comes across as almost like a parody of the Bible. He's got the four evangelists running throughout the whole book. The book's divided in four. There's just a lot of little things that of stuff that he had said about what he was doing, and it's like, oh no, this is probably like the reason why he wants it to last 1,000 years is because that's what sacred texts do. And that's how they acquire their kind of like larger than life properties, is by persisting through time. And I just kind of, when I thought about Finnegan's Wake as being intended as a sacred text, I kind of thought about it more as an object rather than like a text, like the actual physical book. And so I like, this is my copy. It's all B, but it's very small text. It's very there's no design elements to it. So in a flash, I kind of saw the version of Finnegan's Wake that I would like to read, that I would like to own, that I would like to pull off the shelf and study. And so, I think, like how each chapter has an agreed upon name.
Right.
But that's not in the text.
No.
And I think that would be fun to have, to read the source material and say, all right, this is chapter, let me get an example. Yeah, this is book 1, chapter 5, the manifesto of ALP.
Right.
And I think just having that little prompt when you're reading it would help when you're reading the source material, just to have a theme in mind.
Right.
And then obviously my main interaction with Finnegan's Wake is as a visual artist.
Right.
And so I thought it would be fun if Finnegan's Wake had chapter illustrations. It's just something to anchor you into that world. And it's a very, like, despite it not having any organic visual component, it's very evocative of like a certain kind of illustration style. And like I said, I've been drawing stuff from the Wake forever. So I just thought I would love to have a copy of the Wake that was broken down into chapters, broken down into books, had some illustrations, and then also had the what's it called when you have a number for each of the lines, because that's when I've been doing the reading groups, it's been so useful to have the lines.
It's universal.
Like, just have it broken down and be like, oh, and because then you can call everyone to that passage.
That's right.
Everyone knows exactly where to find it. So I was just thinking about what copy of Finnegan's Wake would I like to own, and then I've been doing desktop publishing for 30 years, and I was like, I had illustration, and I could fully make this book. So I was like, whoa, I should make this book.
It sounds like what you're describing is an illuminated Bible. And,
So it's
exactly. It's like the Book of Kells, or
basically take the Skeleton Key, take the Book of Kells, and take Finnegan's Wake and kind of blend it together. But I agree that you wouldn't want to have the commentary running along with the book. Right. But I do think you'd want to have the chapter breakdowns.
Yeah.
I think if you had the chapter breakdowns with an illustration, it would set the stage for you to be able to head into that, to know what you're looking for. Right. And then if you have the line breakdowns, then you can just look it up in the online resources. You go page 7, line 9, and then it pulls it up and you have all the references to it. You don't need to put those references in the book itself, because it's all online, and it's better to be online because it can grow and change and all that. I think of the text in Finnegan's Wake as like a proto hypertext.
Yeah,
sure. How every word is designed to branch out and connect to other words. And that was actually the thesis, Robert Anton Wilson's thesis of this book he was writing, the book he was working on when he died, The Tale of the Tribe, was James Joyce plus Ezra Pound times Marshall McLuhan equals the internet. And that these like encyclopedic writers, and then you have McLuhan with his the idea of a kind of digital super intelligence, that's basically the contributing factors that preceded the internet. You don't need to put the interpretations in the book, but exactly what you're saying, like a book that when you look at it, you know what it is. Like I brought this up on Maybe Night. I've never seen a good cover to a Finnegan's Wake book.
No.
I've never seen a single one.
No, we have this lazy one here that
Yeah,
has
it's fine. It's fine, but it's
has
like
the Thunder word written, in there, because that's apparently the equivalent one. I have the same Penguin Modern Classics edition of Ulysses upstairs, and it's so funny. It has the first half of the page is from the first paragraph of Ulysses, and the last half of the page is the last paragraph of Ulysses. And I go, well, what are you doing? What are you trying to tell us here?
Right.
Like the bookends, and then it's done.
It's just because he wants to have stately plump Buck Mulligan at the top line, and he wants to have "Yes, I will" at the end, and you go, well, hang on, what are you telling us? What? Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, so there's no version of Finnegan's Wake that I think, like, when you can't judge that book by its cover, and I think it would be cool if you could.
Yeah,
and if you could like hold the book and flip through it and be like, oh, this is something worth the trouble, because I don't think right now there is a physical object version of Finnegan's Wake that really invites you in. If anything, it's the opposite. You open it up and you go, right. Like, I think you would. It requires someone having to turn you on to it to make you think that the nonsense is worth investigating.
Absolutely. Well, I think this episode will go a long way towards encouraging future readers. This is such a fascinating conversation, and
I really appreciate you guys. Oh wait, let me throw out one more thing.
Of course.
Just because it popped in my head. It was a conversation from the Reddit that connects here, and I think it's an obvious overlooked component of Finnegan's Wake. So Ulysses ends with the main characters going to sleep, and then Finnegan's Wake is a dream.
Right.
It's such a it's so clear that it's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man is Stephen growing up. He grows up into Ulysses. Ulysses transitions gracefully into Finnegan's Wake. So for all the Ulysses completists out there, I think you got to jump in. I think I think that's where you go after you get to that final yes. Is you fall asleep and you got to go into the dream.
I'm fully on board with that. I think that's a terrific theory. And whether HCE is bloomed, then I think there's plenty of academic articles to be written.
For sure.
That's it. Well, that's fantastic. It's really wonderful to meet you and to have you here today. If people are interested in finding your resources online, where would they go?
I guess Weirdoverse.com is my default website. It's got all my comics, and I don't keep up as much as I should updating all the links and stuff. I do a lot of different projects, but Weirdoverse.com is probably the best place to start. My current project is I'm adapting the Illuminatus trilogy into a comic book. That's nice. Talesofilluminatus.com. So those two places, and I have probably a dozen different websites out there, but those two will get you into the network.
Fantastic. We'll make sure that we link over to those, and we also link to the Maybe Day information as well, so everyone has those information. So that's great. So wonderful to have you on Wake.
I think what you're building here is amazing, and I think that it is a perfect invitation for a reader or an explorer that wouldn't normally probably be invited into this world. And I think that it's awesome what you're doing, and I look forward to getting caught up on the previous episodes and then keeping up with you.
Fantastic. Excellent. Well, that is all the time we have this week for Wake. We'll return next week to continue with our reading as we find ourselves coming up to the end of Book 3. I've been Toby Malone, joined as ever by TJ Young. Thank you, TJ, as always, for being here.
Of course.
And it has been a real pleasure to have Bobby Campbell here with us. And as I said, I'll link to all of his socials and websites in our show notes. See you next week, weirdos.
Just calling us out.
This has been Wake, a cold reading of James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, just to hear it out loud. If you've made it this far, thank you for your dedication. Join us next week for another segment of Finnegan's Wake and a chat about what we've found. Wake is a Moon Street Media podcast, engineered by TJ Young and Toby Malone. Our theme song is The Ballad of Perce O'Reilly, arranged and performed by Meg Logue after James Joyce. Wake is recorded in Canada, where Finnegan's Wake is in the public domain. For community and bonus content, join us at our free Patreon at patreon.com/wakepod. If you have questions about Finnegan's Wake, don't ask us. We're just as confused as you are. See you next week.